Welcome to the 5th episode of Masters and Matches with me, Peter Doggers.
And me, Arne Moll.
We have a special episode today because we are going to talk about Bobby Fischer, the writer. We know Bobby Fischer, of course, as the 11th world champion and one of the best players ever to play and live on this planet. And not only his play, but also his writings have become quite famous, actually. And we thought it was an interesting, let's say, subject on the bigger topic of Bobby Fischer that we might return to later. And this episode will largely consist of an interview we had with the American IM John Donaldson, who has written several books about Bobby Fischer and has a new one just out a few months ago, Inside the Mind of Bobby Fischer, revisiting his writings and annotations. And yeah, as the book, the great book is already showing, there is lots to talk about. Arne, can you tell us a little bit about Bobby Fischer's writings?
Yes, absolutely. Fischer is a fantastic writer. He's one of the best writers ever in the chess world, I think. His most famous book is My 60 Memorable Games, in which he analyzes 60 of his games, not only wins, also some less fortunate games are being analyzed by him. And what I remember is, especially when I bought the book when I was still young, is the language that Fischer uses. He has very memorable use of language. For example, the famous best by test about the move 1e4 is from My 60 Memorable Games. I also I'm very fond of the sentence, pry open the H-file, sack mate, which is about a game in the Dragon, in which he is white and he completely demolishes black.
Bent Larsen.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, and many more quotes. For example, I think Castling Into It is also in that book. The prefaces to the games were written by Larry Evans. These also contain beautiful nuggets. For example, I remember Najdorf's Najdorf from the Najdorf, in which Najdorf didn't play the Najdorf against Fischer. And I learned a lot from the book, also from a more chess ethics perspective. For example, Fischer describes a moment in which he offers a draw in which he is a pawn down. I think it was against Petrosian. And he says, well, I offered a draw not realizing it was bad etiquette. And, these are just some small examples of the book, which I remember. But Fischer wrote a lot more, actually, and Donaldson's book describes everything, at least everything related to chess. He also wrote some other things. Donaldson doesn't go into that. But he wrote Bobby Fischer's Games of Chess, in which he analyzes some of his best games. He had a column in American Chess Quarterly and Boys Live, in which he analyzes games, mostly his own games, and then Fischer Talks Chess, another set of columns in which he analyzes not only his own games, but also, for example, games from the old match between William Steinitz and Serafina Dubois from the mid-19th century. Very unusual for a world champion to write about such an obscure match of more than 100 years ago. And I think all these writings are worth revisiting and worth reading. So in the interview, we'll touch on some of those topics and inspire every listener to look again at the writings of Bobby Fischer.
Great. Sounds exciting. Let's go to the interview. John, thanks for joining us in the show.
Well, thank you for having me.
Nice to have you.
Yeah. Well, Fischer as a topic, always nice to talk about Bobby Fischer, one of my personal heroes. And, well, I assume it's one of yours as well.
Yes. I mean, he's the reason I started playing chess, like a lot of other players of my generation. It was the 72 match that got us started, and I've been fascinated with his career ever since.
Yeah. How many books have you written about him by now?
I've written physical books. I've written 4. The first one was on his exhibition tour, the United States in 1964. He kind of emulated some of his chess heroes like Capablanca and made it travel all around the United States and Canada. And that book's gone into 2 physical editions and then a 3rd ebook. And then I did The Unknown Bobby Fischer with Eric Tangborn. Both those books were done in the last century, but more recently I did, my latest book is Inside the Mind of Bobby Fischer, and about 4 or 5 years ago I produced Bobby Fischer and His World.
Mm-hmm. And it feels like he's a topic that more books could definitely be written about. It's sort of an endless source, isn't it?
It is. Edward Winter on his chess notes, he has a list he keeps of all the books on Bobby Fischer. And Fischer is far and away the individual player that has had more works devoted to him than any other. It's well over 100. And yet, I know that there's several books that are either going to be published in the immediate near future or somewhat down the road. I mean, there's a book, I think, by New in Chess by Shernez Kennedy, and it's sort of in line maybe with a book by Petr Dautov, which European readers had access to several decades ago, but the English language version only appeared like in the last year or two. And both those deal with his life in the 1980s and early 90s, before the match in Sveti-Stefan, which has always sort of been like a dark period, in his career that there's been very little information about.
Do you feel that you have some kind of a niche, that you discovered some secret source yourself to write about when it comes to Fischer?
Well, the real treasure trove of late has been the donation that Bobby Fischer's brother-in-law, Russell Targ, made to the Marshall Chess Club. And then it later made its way to the World Chess Hall of Fame, where I had a chance to view it. This archive, it's like remarkable because it has about 100 games of Fischer's. 50 of them are from like 58 to 60 when he was already a established grandmaster. They're games that are in databases because they're from important tournaments. But from 55 to 57, and even into 58, the training match with Matulovic, there's a lot of games that have never been seen before. Now, I would say most of those games qualify under, if you think of like that movie, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, I would say there's a fair number of them that qualify for the latter. And unfortunately, that's typical. I mean, when you're a young player and you're on the way up, you're not going to always be playing like a world champion. But still, the games are useful because the USCF system of ratings was only published once a year in those years. So it's not always a good gauge for like how quickly he was improving, because the rating was obviously hopelessly out of date every moment practically since it was published. But in the case of Fischer, you can also look at these game scores. And for example, recently there was a article written by Grandmaster Gregory Serper of the United States from the Seattle area, and he looked at some of Fischer's games from the 1955 U.S. Junior, and at the time Fischer, he got a rating of like about 1720 from that. And Serper's conclusion after reviewing the games was he was hopelessly overrated. So that begs a question. How did a guy go from like 1700 to, let's say, 2600? If that's the rating you get when you're a candidate, and he did it in 3 years. If I could bottle that elixir, I could probably become richer than Elon Musk for sure.
By the way, it's something that you really shouldn't be doing in the modern age, because it would be too suspicious, right?
Yes, that's true. That's true. But it didn't. The archive isn't just game scores. It's also a lot of correspondence, and you find out all sorts of fascinating things. For example, Fischer played in the Rosenwald tournament in the fall of '56, and everyone remembers that game of the century. They don't remember too much that he finished with a negative score in the tournament, and it wasn't like he played that game and from then on he played like like a high level grandmaster. It wasn't the case at all. As often for youngsters, in fact the norm. There was a lot of fluctuation back and forth. And so what happened was that he followed that performance up with some more steady results in 1957, including winning his big breakthrough, tying for first in the U.S. Open with Arthur Bisguier. And when he did that, the organizers of Hastings tournament in England, they got very excited because, usually the tournament was just all English players and a handful of foreign players, and the foreign players were usually like one Soviet representative and maybe a Yugoslav. But it, the tournament was famous because there were very few round robins at the time, but it wasn't that interesting from a competitive standpoint. And the idea of having like this young player who would produce an element of unpredictability into it was very attractive for them. But then about a month or two after he got the invitation and of course accepted it, he found himself in a bit of a dilemma because they announced that the U.S. Championship would be held at the end of 1957. And in those days, the U.S. Championship was not held every year. The U.S. Chess Federation had under 5,000 members, and it was really, really poor enough that they couldn't send teams to several Olympiads. They didn't send a team to Amsterdam '54, for example. So at the end of the day, what you find out reading the correspondence is that Regina writes to the U.S. Chess Federation. She says, "I'm sorry Bobby can't play in the U.S. Championship. He's accepted this invitation to Hastings. He would love to play in the championship because not only is it a championship, but it's a zonal. And he'll have to wait 3 more years for the World Championship cycle." And so the end result is that the Hastings organizers, they relieved him of his commitment, and he was able to play in that U.S. Championship. And of course he won it, and then he qualified to play in the interzonal, and then he qualified for the candidates. But Regina was very clear that she wanted Bobby to have high moral standards, and he if he gives his word, he gives his word. So it was fascinating to see that. But there's all sorts of gold to be found in that archive.
Is there any chess-related thing from Fischer himself from this period, like an analysis or something that he wrote down from the early period in the archive?
There is. One of the things, although it's something that later was published, and it's Fischer's first chess work was Bobby Fischer's Games of Chess, and it appeared as a very thin little volume in 1959. And it consisted of his 13 games from the U.S. Championship with annotations. It included his annotations to the Game of the Century that he had published with his mentor, Jack Collins. And then it had all the raw game scores from the interzonal tucked in at the back. But this book was not much more than like 100 pages. Well, that was published by a very prominent American publishing firm, Simon & Schuster. But it turns out from the archive that there's a manuscript for that work, and originally they didn't have Simon & Schuster signed up to be the publisher. Even though he'd won that U.S. Championship that it ended in early '58, they wrote the book. That is, Bobby wrote it and his mother helped him with the typing, and Collins helped him with technical issues. It was written on spec. They had no contract at all, and in fact they actually had to make the diagrams for it by hand. And they, so you see the receipts for and you see some of these old diagrams and stuff like that. So that was pretty interesting to see. Now, of course, Simon & Schuster, by the summer of '58, had signed on to publish the book. So this is, more for the record. The material would have been available anyway. But there's that. And then there's a lot of games that, of course, that are in his hand that were played in, game scores that were played in primarily in open tournaments in the United States, but also there's training games. And I remember long ago, I worked, by the way, for 20 years as a chess director at the Mechanics Institute Chess Club in San Francisco, the oldest chess club continuously operating in the United States. And my predecessor was a man named Max Wilkerson, and he was a real a jack of all cards. He did lots of different things, and in the early 1950s he got his master's in fine arts and painting, and he went to New York City, and he had this idea that he would, see what he could do as an artist there. But as he ruefully explained to me that there were quite a few people with the same idea as him, and it didn't quite work out. But along the way, while he was staying in New York City, he played this young player, and the young player was Bobby Fischer, and he played him at the Manhattan Chess Club. Well, I've heard many people tell me I played Bobby Fischer when he was young. I beat him all the time in Blitz in 1954 or something like that. But it's not possible to prove one way or another. But in this case, I thought, Max never was one prone to exaggeration. So I thought there must be some truth to this. But I was shocked when I looked in this archive and I found 6 games played between them in 1955. Wow. So that was really, really, for me, a very personal discovery, to having known Max very well. He was a really great guy, and they scored 3-3, and it was also a good way to judge how strong Bobby was, because in 55, I mentioned that Gregory Serper had said he was overrated, at 1,700, but that was in the summer of 55. These games were played in the fall of 55, and he was stronger. He was maybe 18 or 1900, but he was still a long way to go.
We are trying to move a little bit to focusing on Fischer as a writer. Yeah, let me start with that question. What do you think makes his writing unique and clearly something that you wouldn't find by other strong players or world champions, for example?
Well, I think one thing that is always been very clear about him is he's always been, and this does not make him unique, but I think it's important to point out nonetheless, he was always very objective in his analysis. I mean, he didn't pretend to see things that he didn't see at the board. He always tried to make his analysis as accurate as possible. I think the fact that he included 3 of his losses in his most famous work, My 60 Memorable Games, that's not the common way. But the key thing there is memorable games, not best games, as he mentioned on more than one occasion. Another thing about Fischer that really makes him a little different from other great world champions in his annotations is his humor. And I include a game that he annotated for his good friend Larry Evans' American Chess Quarterly, which is a magazine that Evans published for several years in the early 1960s. And this was a game between Paul Keres and Sammy Reshevsky, and it was from the first Piatigorsky Cup. And Fischer had been invited to play in this tournament, but he had declined his invitation. He would play in the second Piatigorsky Cup. But in this first one, I would speculate that he declined it in part because there was some bad blood left over from the aborted match that he played with Reshevsky 2 years prior, where Jacqueline Piatigorsky was the organizer of the L.A. leg of the match. The other half of the match was played in New York. And she, before the 11th game, mentioned that there would need to be a rescheduling of that 11th game because her husband, the great cellist Gregor Piatigorsky, he was going to play with Jaffa Heifetz, and they had never played in public before, and this was really special thing, and surely it wouldn't be a big deal to change the starting time of the round from 2 o'clock to 11 o'clock. For Fischer, who rarely, he kept vampire hours, and the idea of waking up at 10 o'clock in the morning would have been horrific. That was a big issue, and also just the sort of lack of respect, if you will. I've signed a contract. I'm going to play this match. Somehow this concert's supposed to be, But on the other hand, you can understand. Jacqueline Piatigorsky, she wanted to hear her husband and Heifetz play. Well, the net result was that 11th game was never played, and the match was not. It was never resumed, and so that led to some bad blood. Fischer sued, and so in '63, instead of playing that Piatigorsky Cup, he played in 2 open tournaments. One of them was in Michigan, the Bay City. It was the Western Open, I think it was called, and then there was another one in Upper New York State, the New York State Open. Those two events he played in. Well, that didn't keep him from obviously studied all the games from the Piotgorsky Cup very carefully. And so he ended up annotating this game between Keres and Reshevsky that was won by Reshevsky in really nice style. So, all right, that's all well done and fine. And the game was Roy Lopez, by the way. And I mention that because Fischer has a note at the beginning of the game, and it's an imaginary dialogue. And it starts off E4, E5, F4. And he internalizes Reshevsky's thoughts in his annotations. And the play is basically like that Reshevsky doesn't know the openings well, and that if you don't play like some old mainstream opening, and you play like one of these old classical gambits, he'll be completely at a loss and he'll lose. And in fact, in this imaginary game, he loses in under 10 moves. So it's kind of funny to see the annotations. I mean, they're a little bit, a little sophomoric, but they're pretty funny to hear. And the ironic thing about it is that Fischer later had the chance to play like a King's Gambit or possibly like a Evans Gambit or two knights, against Reshevsky, but he always played the white side of the Roy Lopez. But his good friend Bernard Zuckerman did play the King's Gambit against Reshevsky at Netanya, and he actually got a very good position out of the opening and was like a pawn up, sort of borderline between like being much better and like winning. But the game ended up in a draw. So that's sort of one good example of Fischer's sense of humor, if you will. And I would say another thing that made Fischer very unique as a chess author, but not necessarily, other world champions have this skill as well, is that they seem to have, many of them seem to have this uncanny ability to reach a very wide audience. The danger is usually you're gonna talk too much up or you're gonna talk too much down. It's going to be interesting for really strong players, but inaccessible to others, or it's going to be just boring for the top players. And Fischer, in both his writings and in the lectures he gave, for example, when he made his 1964 tour, he was always very attentive. He wanted to know, what was his audience, what was their playing strength, and then he adjusted. He wanted to make sure that his message got across. And I think in his writings, they're very accessible. And in particular, you can see that not so much in 60 Memorable Games, because obviously that's aimed for like tournament players, but he wrote a column for Boys Life, which is a American magazine for youngsters, like scouts. And, most of these would have had just a casual experience with chess. They played it with their friends, but they didn't know anything about organized chess, much less playing tournaments. And Fischer writes this column, and his annotations are really good. I mean, I myself as an international master really appreciated them. But they were also good for lesser, less experienced players. And in particular, one of the things that's nice about that column is the fact that my 60 Memorable Games ends with his win. I think it's his win over Stein at Seuss in 67 interzonal. Well, he kept playing for another 5 years, as we know. So, or 4 years. And so the question is, what did he think about his games he played during that time period? And I would say that these annotations, for example, he comments on his game against Miag Masurin. I'm butchering his name, but I think most of your listeners will understand. He's the Mongolian Fischer played at the Seuss interzonal in 67, and Fischer played that famous King's Indian attack game.
And I think he also had trouble with his name, right? There is an anecdote about that.
That's a good point, but it was not. Soltis mentions that Andrew Soltis, who's written a fine book on Bobby Fischer, he wrote about Fischer looking at the Mongolian and being baffled by his name and just writing in the score sheet, a Mongolian. And I looked at that, and Fischer played 3 Mongolians in his career. And he played again, I'm not good on Mongolian pronunciation, so my apologies for those that are Mongols that are listening to this. But he played Utaman in the interzonal in 1970. He played Miag Masurin in the interzonal, and he played in the 1962 Olympiad. I want to say he played against something along the lines of like Przaev or something like that. And I believe it was that first game. And the reason why is it was played in Bulgaria. They used Cyrillic script, and Fischer, looked over his opponent probably didn't know English, and his, the name placards and Olympiads that they post on the side of the boards was in Cyrillic, and he didn't know. But it's kind of interesting because what it would point to is that like a lot of chess players, I believe, they know the names of Russian or Soviet players, I should say, at that time. Soviet players, they know they can recognize the names from Soviet and from Russian language publications, but they couldn't. It's not so much from knowing the alphabet; it's more from just like they've seen it several times, and it just sort of clicks in their mind that this image is in fact the spelling of that name. And Fischer's mother spoke fluent Russian. She lived there for 5 years in the 1930s, and her daughter Joan was born in Moscow. But I'm not so sure that Bobby ever learned to speak Russian. He learned to speak Serbo-Croatian, which is closely related, and that was probably after 62, because Bobby spent, like in 1970, he spent like 3 or 4 months in Yugoslavia, and so he had a good feel for language and probably just picked things up. But I think in terms of like formal knowledge of Russian, I think not, because the only time he was ever in the Soviet Union was just for a few weeks in 1958 prior to the interzonal.
Yeah.
Right.
Do you have an idea where his humor comes from in his writing? Where did he pick that up? Is that something from his personality, or did he borrow that from some other writers?
I think it's from it's just something that came naturally to him, because if you see him on those game shows in 1972, I don't know, you call them game shows, talk shows, but it was with Bob Hope, and he did another one with Johnny Carson, and in particular the one with Bob Hope, he did an incredibly good job of following Hope's lead and telling these jokes and being really witty and funny and very spontaneous. So I think it's something that just came naturally to him.
I guess you have to be really dedicated to master chess.
That's true. You've got to give up everything. Make chess your whole life.
How about girls?
I had a date last night.
No kidding. How'd you do?
Great. I beat her in 4 moves.
There was a lot in the papers about you holding out for a bigger cut of the purse. Were you misquoted?
All that talk about money, 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 money. The important thing to me is what a person gets out of playing the game.
And what's that?
Money.
Yeah, I was wondering if he maybe learned from a writer like Tarrasch, which he admired, I think, and was also very funny sometimes, whether he unconsciously or subconsciously tried to emulate that.
I think that's certainly possible. He definitely he mentioned to Frank Brady that when Brady asked him, like, what was one of the first chess books you remember reading, because his family lived in close proximity to the Brooklyn Public Library, so there weren't the riches of chess literature in English language that there are today, but there were some, and that library had a reasonable selection, and he mentioned that, like, I think Tarrasch is like one of his works was one that he recalled reading when he was very young. I think Tartakover could have been another one who was also very witty. Hard to say.
Yeah, I think we have one or two more questions about my 60 Memorable Games, actually. It's one of the most famous chess books in history still, I believe. Yeah, maybe twofold. What do you personally think makes it so good? And I assume it has to do with the writing and also Larry Evans's role in that. But also what we were discussing before the podcast, do you think young players these days who grow up with the computer and maybe don't dive too much into chess history and chess literature anymore like we used to what extent do you think the young generation can still learn from this book?
Those are interesting questions. I think that One thing I would mention is that there's certain books that people always mention again and again, and I would say like Fischer's My 60 Memorable Games, The Life and Games of Mikhail Tal, Tal's book on the match with Botvinnik, Zurich 53. I mean, how many times have in the last page of New in Chess, and there's that interview with somebody, and they say like, "What's your favorite book?" And it's like just kind of like a default. They'll list that book, and I think that these books they're all excellent, really excellent, and they stood the test of time. But I think there is a little bit of it sort of self-reinforces itself, after a while. But in the case of 60 Memorable Games, my 60 Memorable Games, I would say that I think that, why I was attracted to it was I really enjoyed the annotations. I sort of felt they spoke to me. I felt that they were a good combination of instructive prose and concrete variations where needed. I think we all grew up, with like the Robert Hubner style informant annotations where like they're just like variation after variation after variation, and this before computers. And they were probably the ultimate truth, but they were more like a mathematical exercise than chess annotations. So I think Fischer's commentary seemed very accessible, and yet quite instructive. And but as to younger players, that's a very interesting question. I don't know what the situation's like in Europe, but in the United States, we have there's just like a small army of strong young players that become many of them become like IMs or grandmasters, and then it's almost kind of like the last step for their preparation to go to college. They write down, I became a grandmaster, they get accepted to Harvard or Yale or someplace like that. And then they don't play so much after that, which is fair enough. That audience, I'm not sure that, that Fischer reaches them. But I know, for example, that one person that I was very pleasantly surprised that enjoyed Bobby Fischer and his world was Hans Niemann. And Hans is a reader of classical chess literature, and not a bad player, mind you. And so I think that it depends. I guess that's my answer. I think especially as players get stronger, they maybe get more curious about what other strong players of the past had to say about chess. And so I think for them, it does... It is still very relevant. For young players, particularly the young ones on their way up who play endless blitz and they do puzzle rush 24/7, and they just they gain 200 points overnight. I'm sounding envious now. I think that these for them, and there are players now that become very strong and they don't know how to read. And they don't know how to read because they're not educated. They're just too young, So it's a different world. But I do think that there is still a place for books by Fischer or Alekhine or Capablanca, or I think that for some people, maybe just reading Kasparov's great predecessors sort of fills in the gap. It kind of provides historical foundation for them. But I think there's still a lot to be said for going to the original source.
Can you say something about the role of Larry Evans? For me, reading My 60 Memorable, it's a fantastic book, first of all, because of the analysis, as you point out, but also the language itself and the certain phrases that Fischer uses, which have become completely classics in the world of chess. But I also, when I read your book last night, I noticed that the role of Evans, not only writing the introductions, but perhaps also supporting with the writing of the analysis itself, is interesting to say the least. Can you say something about the writing process of My 60 Memorable Games?
I can. I got to know Larry Evans reasonably well in the 2000s, and I would go to play every year in a tournament in Reno, the Western States Open, and he lived in Reno. He made it his home from like 1970 until his death, and he would always be like the special guest of the tournament, and he would give a lecture, and the topic oftentimes would, Evans had a very long career. He was a very fine player when he was young. He was U.S. champion. He was probably one of the top 20 players in the world in the 1960s. There's an argument to be made that after Fischer, Evans was the best American player in the 1960s. Ahead of Lombardi, ahead of Robert Byrne. It's close. You could make, or Benko. You could have a debate, but he was very strong, very tough to beat, and there was some that thought he should have played when the USSR and the world met in a match in 1970. He should have been playing instead of Matulovic, for example. That he would have blocked on his board, and unlike Matulovic, who got beaten pretty decisively by Botvinnik. Evans was also a real journalist, and he could write really well. And he also had been a friend of Fischer's all the way back. I think he gave him a ride from the Canadian Open in '56 from Montreal back to New York, and so they went way back. Even though there was this age difference between them of like over a decade, they still had a connection. And Evans hosted Fischer in Reno at his home in the early 1970s. I would say the first thing to keep in mind is I think all the concrete analysis is Fischer's and Fischer's alone. So that's number one. Yeah. I think the introductions, for the most part, were all written by Evans. And I think that that it was a combination of the two for the text that appeared in the notes of the book. And what I mean by that is I think all the ideas and all the expressions are Fischer's, but I think that Evans was able to capture them on the page in a way that Fischer would have been unable to. Right. And so are the thoughts in 60 Memorable Games all Bobby's? Yes, with the exception of the introductions. And that begs an interesting question because Fischer always considered, this book his, something special, and understandably so. And therefore, when John Nunn and Graham Burgess and Batsford made some, quote, corrections on it in the 1990s, he was livid. Yes. But much earlier, like 20 years earlier, his good friend Bernard Zuckerman pointed some things out to Bobby, which I included in this book. And they included a lot of errors of fact. Not errors in the analysis, but simply errors of fact. Like if I were to say that Den Bosch was the capital of the Netherlands, well, obviously it's not true, and it should be corrected. Okay, and you can have a lot of different opinions on a lot of different things, but this is simply a fact, and facts should be treated as such. And so, what Zuckerman had seen was there were a number of times. Not that many, and they're very small things, things that would probably most readers would never observe, but he was such a keen chess historian and knew Bobby so well that he spotted. For example, one was there was a game, the first time that Fischer beat Tall, and you have to remember that prior to that, they Bobby took a terrible beating, for example, in the Candidates in '59, and I even include a postcard from the World Chess from this Targ archive in the book where Bobby complains to his mother that he was completely winning against Tall, and Tall was jumping up and down and trying to distract him, and he couldn't play, and he blundered and he lost the game. Well, the thing is that in this note, Fischer says, I could have aimed for a quicker win, but I wanted to go for the sure win. I knew that this might not be the fastest, but in this particular game, in lieu of the fact that I had such a terrible record against him, he doesn't use that phrasing, but that's what he's alluding to. He said, gosh, I better choose this dependable method to win, because prior to this, my score was, say, like 2.5, 6.5. Well, Zuckerman pointed out it wasn't 2.5, 6.5. It was 3-7. There was one game he'd overlooked. Yeah. Not the biggest deal in the world, okay? But still, if you're going to do a reprint, you want to get it right? Yeah. I mean, if this is a perfect book, you want to make it even more perfect. And there were other things in it. Another thing I remember was that in the introduction to, I think, one of the games with the Argentine player, Fischer said, well, he didn't say it, Evans did, because Evans wrote the introduction. He said, he made reference to the fact how important 1939 was to the development of chess in Argentina, because the Olympiad was held that year, and many of the top European players chose to stay and not return, to face the, uncertainties of what was going to happen. And so I think Eliscassis and Stahlberg and he mentioned Pilnik also. And as somebody pointed out, Pilnik, he moved to Argentina like in the early 1930s, and he didn't play in the 39 Olympiad. Now, again, not the end of the world, hardly. I mean, doesn't, in the scheme of things, but if you're going to do a reprinting of it, why not correct it? And there were about maybe a dozen to 24 of these little factual miscues that you would have thought Bobby would have wanted to change. Yeah, but it seems like at a certain point, it's like, this is the way the book is, this is the way it should always be, which is fair enough. I mean, but still it is kind of interesting, because it kind of goes against, the Fischer, well, there's a story that's told by Helge Olafsson in his book on Bobby that was published by New in Chess, which deals principally with Fischer's years in Iceland. And he mentions that Bobby was watching Icelandic TV, and on the TV they were broadcasting some rapid tournament, and he spotted something that both players missed, something very pretty, a nice combination that was somewhat analogous to the one that he had played back in his first U.S. championship against Sherwin. And so he called up Helgi, and he was all excited, and he mentioned this. And Helgi was even more excited, and he said, God, this is great. Could I include it in my column in the newspaper? And Bobby said, no. He said, come on over here. Let's sit down. Let's move the pieces. Let's double check everything, triple check everything. So there was this, meticulousness of Fischer, and this desire to make sure that whatever would appear in print would be correct. So, nobody's 100%, we're human beings. We're not always internally consistent, but still there's this little, kind of strange juxtaposition where there's Fischer, who wants everything to be just accurate and this other one who just let the knows of mistakes and doesn't fix them.
Yeah. Great. I have one question which is not related to my 60 memorable games, but to the analysis that Fischer made of the Steinitz-Dubois match, which is a quite little known match, I think, nowadays. But I wanted to start with one thing that I found absolutely fascinating, which you wrote in the book, is that Fischer, when he was playing in New York in the 50s, he probably met with some players who were playing there who still had met Steinitz themselves. There was a connection between Steinitz and him. And maybe that started to fascinate him on that topic. Can you say something about that match and particularly the analysis that Fischer made? I wondered when I read some of the analysis whether he actually did write everything down himself for that match, as opposed to maybe working with Evans on the my 60 memorable games. But for this match, he did it himself.
So first off, Stefano Dubois is probably not a household name to most chess players today. And it wasn't to Bobby Fischer's readers when he commented on this game in circa 63-64. And he analyzed, it says something that these games were published in a column that he wrote, Fischer Talks Chess, that was published in Chess Life, which was the official magazine of the U.S. Chess Federation. Yeah. And I mentioned earlier that the USCF, like in the late 1950s when Fischer was coming up, they had under 5,000 members. And that was probably still the case, or maybe they had maybe 1,000 or two more by 63. But they didn't have a lot, and they would not until the Fischer boom in the early 1970s just changed things overnight. And so the editor of Chess Life was a guy called J.F. Reinhardt. And Reinhardt, he had to do two jobs. He had to be the editor of Chess Life, and he was also the business manager of the U.S. Chess Federation. And, basically he's doing like two full-time jobs. But he did remarkably good work. And one of the smart things he did is he allowed Bobby the space to have this, to air his voice through this column. And the working procedure was usually that Fischer and Reinhardt would get together, and Fischer would dictate the column to Reinhardt. So Reinhardt would have all of Fischer's analysis, he'd have all of Fischer's thoughts, but it was up to him to put it down on paper, if you will. Okay. And so I think that method was used also for the Boys Life column as well. I don't think that Fischer ever wrote, and then, what you can do if you want to check on this is Fischer wrote a book with Belica, a Yugoslav journalist, around 1970, and it was Chess Meets of the Century, and it consisted of Fischer annotating all his games from the Blitz tournament held after that event, and also annotating the two of the four games he played with Petrosian, I believe. And that manuscript that served as the basis for that book was auctioned off. And I believe you could probably still find pages of it. Like they did, ChessBase published an article on it, and when it was about to get auctioned off. But from that, you can see actually what Fischer's annotations are like without an editor. Okay, that's the only case. They're still very, you can still read them and they're still understandable. Also, I produced some of his writing in the book, like in postcards and, notes and things like that. So you can get some feel. I mean, he could communicate perfectly well in English, but his knowledge of English grammar was not perfect, shall we say. Right. So that match, how did Fischer get interested in Steinitz? Well, you mentioned that Fischer knew some people that actually personally knew Steinitz, okay? And to back up just a little bit, Steinitz was born in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He lived for many years in England. But starting in the early 1880s, he started to spend more time in the United States. And when he played the match in 1886 with Zukertort for their first official world championship, it was played in New York, St. Louis, and New Orleans. And he wanted to play with an American flag. This was denied because he was not yet an American citizen, but he would be within a few years. So he played several of his world championship matches, all, in fact, except for the one in 1886, as an American citizen. And I think that's important because, the United States sort of has a reputation sometimes as like, it develops talent, but it also drafts a lot of talent. A lot of strong players come to the United States. And there's some question, like, should those players be considered like for their native country or for the United States? And I think in the case of Steinitz, you can make a case that, he did spend a lot of time in England. But certainly it appears from all accounts that his happiest times were in the United States from 1886 to his death around circa 1900. And this is the time when he was very productive. He wrote The Modern Chess Instructor. He published his International Chess Magazine, and he played all these matches. And Steinitz was quite a larger, he was a short man, but he was kind of a larger-than-life figure. So two of the people that were around in American chess in the last half of the 19th century were Hermann Helms, the famous journalist, and I believe Harold Phillips was the other one. I'm not 100% sure on that. But Helms definitely. And so when we haven't really talked too much about it, but one question is like, Fischer's development. Was he a prodigy or was he not? Well, he was in the sense that he qualified for the candidates when he was 15 years old. That's pretty good. But as I mentioned earlier, when he was 12, he was as Gregory Serper put it, he was overrated at 1730. So the question is, how did Fischer get to be so good? And essentially what it was in May of 1956, he was playing in the Memorial Day U.S. Amateur Championship in Asbury Park, New Jersey, and he met for the first time Jack Collins. And Collins was, one of the top 15, 20 players in the United States, a very well-known correspondence player. He would author an edition of Modern Chess Openings. He's very, very knowledgeable chess player. And it just happened very fortuitously that he lived like within roughly a mile of Fischer. Fischer lived, if you're familiar with Brooklyn, he lived near the top half of Prospect Park, near the Brooklyn Public Library, and Collins lived at the very bottom part of Prospect Park, nearby, close to where Erasmus High School was. So Bobby, from the spring of 56, when I would say he was about 2100, to the spring, let's say after the interzonal, so like September of 58, about 2.5 years, he goes from like 2100 to 2600. And that 20 is all, as we all know, the air does not get easier to breathe the higher you climb. It's in fact the contrary. It becomes thinner and thinner, and fewer and fewer make the journey up the slopes. So, in the case of Fischer, that 500-point rating jump was from like a good club, very good club player to world championship candidate was remarkable. And I think that one of the main contributors to it was the time that Fischer spent at Collins' home. And he, as I mentioned, Collins lived close to Erasmus High School, which Fischer was attending. And so Fischer would, at his lunch hour, would go to Collins' home, share lunch with him, and, look at chess. And then at 3 o'clock, after Fischer had gone back to school and he would return to Collins' home, and then he would be there until like 9 o'clock at night, because Fischer's mother had a job as a nurse that, the hours were long and pay was probably poor too. But essentially, those 2.5 years, Fischer lived much of his life at Collins' home, and Collins had a fantastic library in multiple languages, including the 4-volume work by Bachmann on Steinitz. He also had a steady stream of extremely strong players coming to to his home. One of them was Ray Weinstein, who would later in 1960 play in the gold medal student team, the silver medal Olympic team, and take third in the U.S. Championship and win the Marshall Chess Club. So a lot of times it would be Weinstein, Fischer, and Collins playing risers, where they would play 10-second chess and two people would play and the loser would have to get up. And at first Fischer probably had to get up a lot, but later on he probably just kept the seat warm all the time. Yeah. And there were players like Lombardi and the Byrne brothers and others that would frequent on the weekends. And so, it was a tremendous environment for the young Fischer. It was kind of like he could just immerse himself in chess and just breathe in the air. And one of the things, sort of intangibles, was that people like Helms, who wrote a column for the Brooklyn Daily Eagle and other New York papers, and Phillips, they would frequent this club. So, there would be like, guys talking about Steinitz. I'm sure it was very inspirational, and he was playing over Steinitz games. And you can see how Steinitz affected him, because a lot of his opening choices, like knight h3 in the two knights defense, 5d3 in the Roy Lopez, which is very, very popular right now, are just two good examples of that Steinitzian influence. and of course Steinitz also, he, as your compatriot, Mr. Hendricks has written, those guys were vicious back in the 1800s. The poison pens, their annotations and their writings with their contemporaries were pretty over the top. And Steinitz was right at that he could give it as good as he got it. And so I'm sure that, when you mention like Fischer's sense of humor and stuff, reading Steinitz was never boring. So I think that also kind of factored into his views of the great world champion.
The last thing we wanted to talk about was the famous article based on an interview, actually, I believe, where I believe in 1964 in a magazine from Frank Brady, Fischer mentions what he thought was the 10 greatest players of all time. It's very famous. And Arne has a few questions, one or two questions about it. I'll just mention to the listeners of the podcast that, at the time Fischer was 21, and he made his list of best players of all time. So in 1964, he mentioned Paul Morphy, Howard Staunton, Wilhelm Steinitz, Siegbert Tarsch, Mikhail Chigorin, Alexander Aljechin, Jose Capablanca, Boris Spassky, Michael Tal, and Samuel Rzuszewski. Arne, your question about this famous article.
Yeah, my question is, do you think that Fischer's words in the end got accepted by the wider chess community? I think there was a big, probably not a scandal, but there was a big discussion after it was published why he had not included Botvinnik, for example, and there was a bit of controversy over including Staunton as well, I think. But do you think ultimately Fischer was right in having this list mentioned as he did? Or do you think that basically still, if you would ask someone like Garry Kasparov or Anatoly Karpov or even Carlsen, they would completely not agree with Fischer because they have completely different view on that?
Well, I think the thing you have to really look at it closely. So just as it's not my 60 best games, it's my 60 memorable games, Fischer didn't say these are the 10 best players of all time. He said they were like the 10 most influential and important players of all time, not the best. Okay, and because obviously, he left off Lasker, he left off Alekhine and Botvinnik. How can you leave these guys off the list of the greatest players of all time as of 1964? And I think that Steinitz was very controversial at the time. How could you include this guy? But Steinitz was very influential in developing chess, and that's why he, through his writings, he in his play, he played a pivotal role in making chess more modern. It's easy to forget, but for example, we mentioned Dubois a little while ago. He lived at a time where in Italy, it was not uncommon to play more or less the rules of chess that we play today, but with the exception that when you castled, you could put your rook on e1 when you castled kingside. The Boden-Kizaritsky gambit would all of a sudden become like almost a forced win or something like that, I guess, if you get that extra tempo in. But Fischer did, he made a second list that appeared around 1970. And in that list, he did shift some of the names. I don't think Alekhine still made it because Fischer found Alekhine's style sort of impenetrable. He had these super sharp openings, and he would gain the initiative, and then he would just carry that initiative through. You think of some of the old school tennis players like Roscoe Tanner. He would have this really powerful serve, and if the serve was on, he could force his opponents onto their back, and then just finish them off. Serve's not on. It wasn't quite so good. But in the case of Fischer's second list, he also added like Gligorich to the top 10, and that might have been partly because it was for like Yugoslav television. Gligorich was a great player and a wonderful person, but I don't think most people would because I think the second list was just like a top 10 list, unlike the first.
Okay.
it's interesting that there's certain players that don't really, when you associate Fischer with a player, it might be like, say, for example, Capablanca. He admired Capablanca's clarity of play. But he made an interesting observation. He said that Capablanca, everybody thought he was like, this, the thing about him that was special, he's a great endgame player. But Fischer said that he was actually a really sharp middle game player because he played the opening so indifferently that he usually had very little to work with, and he'd play really finely in the middle game to get something going. So that was kind of an interesting observation for me. But I would say that if you look at, for example, Lasker, talk about a player who's has gotten like a second look this century. I mean, I can't think of any other strong player that has been elevated, up to the very top ranks. I mean, he was always, a great world champion. He always, he had this tremendously long reign, although part of that's just because of, World War I, and also because of the fact that many times it wasn't easy to find sponsors to play the matches. It wasn't like he was defending his title every 2 years, for example. But Lasker certainly has undergone a profound reappraisal, if you will, because of, the changes in chess where the opening is, it's been democratized and top players, have difficulty getting much from it. Botvinnik, he also changed his mind about. And in particular, it might have had to do because there was talk in 1970 that there would be a match in the Netherlands between Botvinnik and Fischer. That didn't materialize. Botvinnik ended up playing, I think, if not his last tournament, one of his very last tournaments in Leiden, a tournament where Jan Hein Donner did brilliantly. He was playing like with Spassky, I think, and Larsen and Botvinnik, and he made an even score. So I think Donner's probably like one of the most uneven players in the history of chess. He could beat like the best, and he could lose to like really weak players too. So he was also one of the great characters. I mean, modern day chess we really don't have people like Donner anymore. I mean, the professionals are super professional. They don't smoke, they don't drink, they go to bed at 10 o'clock. They get 8 hours of sleep. They go to the gym and they work on chess like super hard. And it's understandable because all their compatriots are doing it, but chess has also lost a little bit of its color, if you will, from the some of the characters of the past. So Botvinnik, I was very surprised to discover that Fischer, when he presented games for Yugoslav television in 1970, that he did a series on all the world champions, and he chose 2 games of Botvinnik's, and they were very early games not known. They're included in this book because I thought, it's his spoken word and his written word. I should include it, these annotations, and they're quite good. And it's clear that he probably seriously prepared for that match with Botvinnik. And one thing about Fischer, when it came to chess, I can't say about activities outside of chess, but when it came to chess, he was always very objective, and he was willing to, if evidence presented itself, to reevaluate his opinions. He was very flexible in that sense. Other parts of his life, not necessarily so, but in chess he certainly was. And so I think it's fascinating when you see those kind of lists. I think they're a good thing because they get people thinking about some of those players. I mean, like Staunton, I'm sure that a lot of players today, they just think of him, well, he's the guy that like Morphy would have crushed if he played him. And the guy, like, he wrote some Shakespeare stuff, but he's actually a great Shakespeare scholar, and he was also a great chess player, but it's kind of, not on the front page for most chess players.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Yeah, this was all fascinating. Thank you so much. I think we learned more about Fischer as a writer, but also about other aspects. So it was a pleasure talking to you, John.
And you guys as well. I thank you very much for having me.
I really enjoyed the interview, Peter.
Yeah, that was great. And for the listeners who are interested in that new book from John Donaldson, I will mention the title one more time. It's Inside the Mind of Bobby Fischer, revisiting his writings and annotations. So yeah, that was it for this episode. Hope you enjoyed it, and see you next time.
See you next time.